Welcome back, everybody, to Flatirons Tuning. This is another episode of
Hey, what's your problem?
And here with DP. And where we're going to start this episode is with the customer Will, that reached out to us through live chat. We have the advantage with this one, because we talked to Will through live chat. We've actually had a lot of conversations with him, got a lot of information from him. This turned out to be a really interesting problem, and that's why we wanted to bring it to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, this took us a couple of days of work and some real, head scratchers to try and get to the bottom of it. Poor guy's been working with this problem, and finally, we got some resolution.
Yeah. Now, before we dive into all this, just want to say, if you like what we're doing and you want to support us with this contract, and you want to support the content that we're putting out, DP, what is the best way that they can do that?
You know, the best way to keep us doing what we're doing and help us out is to go to our Patreon page, and just a little monthly contribution will get you exclusive access to ad-free content and early content before it goes out to everybody else.
Yeah, we're doing our best to get stuff out early to Patreon. We've been a little bit lax with that, but we're going to really kind of double down on that going forward. And it's just something where, this is obviously brought to you by Flatirons Tuning. You can absolutely head over to the Flatirons Tuning website, and your support there is definitely what keeps the lights on, quite literally here. But to support the content directly, the best way to do that is through our Patreon page. We really appreciate all of our Patrons. Thanks for all your support. We've got some things that is going to start turning into here soon, and we're really excited about it. And the more of you that can help basically jump on Patreon and help us with a little contribution each month, that should really open the doors to some new content, some new possibilities for us.
Absolutely. And it sounds really cool to say, I'm a patron of Flatirons Tuning.
Yes. There's actually some exclusive things. I know that I think we've got them up now. We've got maybe a mug and a t-shirt or something. Yeah. There's some things where you can get some cool merch that is Patreon exclusive up there now. So, and hopefully we're just going to keep doing more of that stuff.
Yes.
All right. So with that all said and out of the way, let's dive into this question. So, DP, how did this all start? What was the first point of contact here with Will?
Well, first point of contact, Will reached out to us via our ticket system, which is really a great useful tool for us, and for the customer, because you get to pick our brains.
Yeah.
And Will said, "Hey guys, I hope you can lead me in the right direction. I've been having one huge problem that's leaving me and my Subaru helpless for the past few months." Oh no, helpless. Yeah. That's hard. I've been working with my 2010 STI with a built engine running an ACL 12mm orbital pump, but I keep having a P0021 code pop up after the vehicle's at operating temperature.
Right. And what is what is that code? And then he gave us another really key piece of information in this first.
Well, that code is left side bank AVCS solenoid not functioning.
Right.
Which, that's kind of an interesting point. Why is the left side not working on the intake AVCS?
Right.
Well, we pried a little bit, and Will found that he had a 7 psi at oil pressure on his new aftermarket gauge.
At full temperature idle.
Yeah.
Which is, we all kind of talk about that, going that's not good, and actually wondering if that's even possible.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought you could even make just that low pressure and keep it running.
Yeah, so the cars have an oil pressure sensor, and basically there will be a light that turns on if the pressure is low. It's a dummy gauge. It just comes on once the oil pressure is below a certain point, which I believe is 16 psi. Okay. And this is well below that.
Yes.
And usually, if that light turns on and you're driving the car, even if the car is just sitting at idle, that's real bad, and usually that means that you're an imminent failure is pending. And to hear this, it sounds like, well, he's kind of dwelling in this very low oil pressure. So what was kind of the first thought that we had?
Well, I thought first off, maybe oil pump. It's
sure,
it could very well be that we have an oil pump issue here where it's just not pushing what it needs to push. But when it's
right.
when it's cold, obviously the viscosity is way up there. It's real easy. It's like you're creating more pressure because.
And that's it. That's key detail, and that's what he said, is that it's only once the car warms up that the AVCS fails, would throw the P0021 code, and then once it gets to full operating temperature, then that's where the idle oil pressure would drop. But at cold, when the oil being thick, everything seemed to be okay. So, yeah.
So beyond that, we dug in a little bit further, and Will gave me some more information.
Well, before we go into any more information, the other key thing is, one of the questions again, is the gauge reading right?
Right.
With oil pressure gauges, there's going to be some variance there. When you see a gauge, what we like typically is, the needle moves to a certain spot, and then the needle stays there.
Right.
But with oil pressure, there's a lot of change going on. That's not how an oil pressure gauge will read. It will move around, like depending on the RPM, depending on the temperature of the oil, you're going to see different pressure readings. So that needle or the gauge is going to give you different readings.
Right.
And so there's a difference in placement of the sensor. Are you going to put the sensor right on the top of the front of the block where the factory sensor is, or are you going to put it on the back of the block, or are you going to put it somewhere else? Depending on the placement of the sensor, that's going to change the reading a little bit.
Right.
And had a lot of conversations with people where once you put a pressure sensor on, if you've not, or a gauge on, if you've not used it before, what you really have to do is drive around the car for a little bit and just get a sense of, okay, what is normal?
Okay.
Because now once you know the range of pressures that you're going to see, like a cold start, hot idle, 3,000 RPMs, wide open throttle, whatever, then you can start to see some discrepancies if things start to change. That might tell you that, okay, something has gone off.
Okay, so like establishing a good baseline for your car, not just going on like what everybody else's car is doing, but like my car runs at at 20 degrees, it's going to be 40 psi at idle.
So there was a bit of a question of like, are we into that? Like, where is this oil pressure reading from?
Right.
Like, how's it installed? And at one point he told us it's a Pro Sport gauge, which is a gauge that is on the affordable end,
right,
and is kind of known maybe to not be as accurate as others. And so, again, like this level of oil pressure at idle it seems like it shouldn't be possible. So, like, is it actually happening, or is there something else going on? Or
it's kind of a mystery there. And so we dug in a little bit, and I asked, hey, can you hook up a mechanical gauge? And I didn't get anything. So then we went and was like, well, maybe we need to condemn this. Let's try a different oil pump.
Right. So on the list of possibilities, there's like ideals of what testing could be done, and then he has done a lot of things. And honestly, like with the engine running, it kind of points to the fact that, well, maybe this reading at idle oil pressure is not 100% accurate, because like, holy cow, is that even possible?
Right.
And so like, could it be an issue with this oil pump that he had? It sounds like, I think he had just put it on when the engine was built, or something along those lines. There was a little bit of gray area there. So the oil pump was, it's a possible culprit. I mean, there are potential issues with oil pumps that will cause low oil pressure.
Right.
Now, and I should also say here that the AVCS check engine light, that is synonymous with having an oil pressure issue. So what we've kind of got here is two different things, like to a certain extent, two different things. One is this low idle oil pressure, which seems like almost impossible, but also this AVCS fault code, which is related typically to low oil pressure. So it kind of tells us that there really is a problem going on.
Yeah.
But like, do we have accurate information here?
Right, and so it's good to establish again like a good baseline for like known good parts, and so suggested an oil pump.
Yep.
I believe you with 12 millimeter pump.
12 millimeter factory JDM pump. Yep.
Yeah, like the OEM JDM pump, and so we put that in.
Yep.
And waited, because this is a waiting game for us. It's like,
yeah, that's not a quick and simple install. There's some stuff involved, so to get that installed and actually get some data again.
Yeah, and he wrote back. He had an update for me, and so at idle at full operating temperature, now he was between 8 and 9 psi. So we went up a little bit. So it's like, all right, well, that's great. We're getting somewhere, kinda.
Well, yeah.
Because like, well, now we've increased 1 whole psi according to the gauge.
1 to 2 psi, and the point is, it's more.
Yep.
And it's two 12 millimeter pumps. So this is the new one. It's new, known good pump, and we see an increase. And so that's where, okay, maybe it was an issue to do with the pump to some extent.
Right, like that could have been part of our contributing issue. And Will drove the car, and everything seemed to be working. ABS was functioning, so he was happy because he's getting his timing. He's getting all those things fast. But he drove it in one day, and he had 0 degrees ABCS. Pulled the same DTC. P0021 came when he was getting off the highway, about 3,000 RPM or so.
Yep. And so the problem was back. So we're seeing now with the gauge that it is reading a little bit higher. the problem seemed to be less pronounced with AVCS, but it came back. So
Right.
it's still there, which, again, that AVCS fault code is kind of one of those canaries in the coal mine that tells you where maybe there's something going on with oil pressure and or the oiling system.
Yep.
And so this was pretty interesting. And at this point, I think this is where we decided, well, we really need to know with as known a degree of accuracy as possible what the oil pressure in the engine was.
Right. So at this point, I asked him, can you hook up a mechanical gauge? Can you get me, just get a little port right in there, pop, give me a real oil-fed, old-school diaphragm gauge that shows what we're at.
Right. So that we know what the pressure is. And that's what he did.
Yep.
And so we saw this gauge, and it was, I think, a little bit higher than even what his Pro Sport gauge was reading.
Right. I think it was sitting like 11-12 when he ran it at idle.
Right.
And then he he goosed it a little for us.
To 3,000 RPMs. That was one of the other questions we had. It's like, okay, well, we're talking about idle pressure. What kind of oil pressure are you seeing at, say, 3,000 RPMs? When everything's kind of moving around, the pump is doing more of its job. And he said 40, but then this needle on this gauge was doing some weird stuff.
It jumped. All of a sudden, it jumped and bounced around a little bit, and then it kind of stabilized out. But it was freaky. Like, it was kind of a wild thing. Like, what is going on with this oil pressure?
So here's what's crazy. So we've got Sweet House here, another Mike, who, let's just say, he's got a lot of experience with oiling systems. He is definitely a resource in this regard. And he saw this video of this gauge doing this thing, and he looked at it, and the first thing he said is, that oil pump is cavitating. And we said, well, it can't be cavitating. This is only at 3,000 RPMs. And he's like, well, no, I mean, when you see a gauge that moves like that, and this big jump in pressure, that's what you see when the oil pump cavitates. And we're like, that doesn't make sense, but okay.
Yeah.
So now at this point, again, we had a mod list. The key detail here is that it's a built engine.
Right.
But in going back and seeing what this pressure was, and knowing that he's still having this issue, we got the build sheet, and we started to really kind of explore in more detail what this built engine was.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you remember some of the key details that jumped out at this point?
I remember the bearing clearances on the mains and the rods were on the loose side.
That they were loose, but there's actually another detail even on top of that, which is that where this had all come up is he had gone in and rebuilt the engine again.
Right.
So the engine was built a handful of years ago, and he had an issue. He had an engine failure. Sounds like head gaskets and maybe some other issues going on.
Yeah.
But then he went in and refreshed it again recently.
Right.
Now he sent the crank off to a machine shop, and they told him it was within spec, but found out that it had been polished on the initial build a handful of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so because everything was within spec still, he just bought another set of the same size bearings as the builder had originally used and put the engine back together with all of that stuff.
Right.
Now, when we looked at the specs on the build sheet, which I think he sent us this build sheet a bit earlier on, but we didn't really look into it in detail.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, a lot of times, I mean, it's a built engine. We're not to the point where we're thinking like there's some kind of critical flaw here, but now we're kind of thinking, well, maybe there's something deep in the roots of this engine that's going on. And so we looked at the specs. What did you see at that point?
Notice that all the rods were out 2/1000 over
Looser.
loose, and mains were between 1 and 2/1000 loose as well.
Above the maximum factory spec.
And then thrust was above maximum spec too. So we were really on what is known in the industry as the looser side past the OEM spec.
Right. So significantly loose. And knowing that was the original build sheet, and he's now refreshed the engine.
Right.
And it sounds like because the crank checked out, whatever that means, it sounds like he did not measure everything as he was putting it back together. So there may be even more signs of wear or variance, and everything was looser even still.
Yeah.
And so with that piece of information, so then, Mike is here, Sweet House, and we ran it by him. He's like, okay, if you have that loose of a bearing tolerance, like the oil pump does need some pressure to work properly.
Right.
It has to be able to like have some resistance to send the oil through the engine. And if that's basically not present, that can cause cavitation. Because so everything is working on the feed side. So the pump is pulling oil up out of the pickup tube, going into the pump, and it's being compressed. And as soon as that compressed chamber moves to send the oil into the engine, there's just no resistance there. So that pressure is immediately released.
Right.
That very rapid release of pressure can cause the cavitation.
Yeah.
And so basically, with all of these pieces of the puzzle and knowing what his first reaction was to looking at this gauge, well, he was right. It seems strongly likely that he was 100% right, that what we were seeing with this mechanical gauge was the pump cavitating even just at 3,000 RPMs under no load, because the tolerances were so loose that the pump just did not have near enough volume to really properly pressurize the engine and get everything working properly.
And just for clarification on what cavitation really is, when you've got that, you're flash boiling and releasing effectively a sonic boom of the oil. So you're creating little tiny, tiny explosions that have huge power, and that can be extremely detrimental to an oil pump.
And it can happen on the inlet side, or now what we've discovered is on the outlet side as well. So on the inlet side, if you're trying to suck the oil in, and this is what we talked about in some of the videos we made with oil pumps, is you get to a larger and larger rotor, and you're trying to fill a larger and larger space with oil as that pump rotor comes around.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're not able to fill that space entirely, and basically you create this vacuum as you're doing that vacuum can cause cavitation because it drops the pressure and basically the boiling point drops, and so that's where you can get the cavitation because the oil boils.
Yeah.
And it seems like what we're seeing in this case is with that lack of resistance on the feed side, the pressure was also dropping very rapidly, and that's what was causing this cavitation issue.
Yeah.
So the interesting point here is it possible to have too loose of a bearing clearance? And I mean, intrinsically you'd say yes, but now we have a real interesting baseline point of information of if you have way too loose of bearings, this is what can happen, and that's what's happened in this case. Now, what was the other really interesting thing that Will mentioned is he had actually had a very interesting oil pump failure, which was he broke the rotor. He took the oil pump off the engine, one of the old, which I think is what spawned him to put on the ACL 12mm pump in the first place.
Right. And
that rotor had broken. And going through this with Sweet House, the first thing he said was, if you have this cavitation problem, that stress, that shock load to the gyro rotor, that can cause a rotor to crack or to fracture.
Okay.
So this whole problem, the root of this problem with bearing tolerances could all come back to the fact of what damaged the pump in the first place and kind of precipitated this whole build and everything.
Yeah, it's such an interesting situation. I mean, reading this is wow. Just a series of things, but it kind of is fun, for me, because it's the diagnostic process. Well, where are we going to start? We're going to start with something simple-ish. We'll take a known good part, put it on. Okay, well, we still have an issue. Let's put a gauge on it. Let's take the digital gauge out, because there is a little bit of ambiguity that can happen with an electronic feed gauge.
Well, and get some redundancy. Put a second gauge on. Confirm the results. And because you don't want to jump to... if you're going to make a big change because of the reading that you're getting, make sure that the reading is right. And honestly, knowing that he was driving the car a bit and not having a catastrophic failure, it just didn't seem initially that it was possible that this low oil pressure was accurate. It seemed more likely that it was an issue with the gauge or the reading or whatnot, versus no, this is legitimately what the idle oil pressure was.
Right. Houston, we have a problem. It's maybe we do actually have a situation.
Right. But it's, again, it's that AVCS P0021 code, which is driven by or caused by oil pressure most commonly. I mean, that really was the thing that kept us looking into it, and that was the ongoing problem that he had. And so, I mean, the unfortunate case in this, and first tip of the hat to Will for doing all of this work, coming back to us, keeping us up to date on the build and letting us know what he found. I mean, the unfortunate part is it kind of looked like he needs to go in and put a new engine in the car to be safe, but man, as unfortunate as that is and as bad as that is, he hasn't had a catastrophic failure yet.
Yeah.
This is something where you can take everything apart, rebuild the engine, check the bearing tolerances, or just put in a new sharp block, and largely everything should be usable. I mean, it's unfortunate, but being able to catch and get to the bottom of this problem now before it is catastrophic, I mean, that does make it a much simpler, much less expensive repair.
Absolutely, but just doing that little bit of due diligence, is like, hey, I've got this weird issue, and like knowing something's not right, especially when like one half of your VCS system isn't working, it's
Right.
like,
And
well,
staying on it.
Yeah.
Staying on it, like doing the research, trying to figure it out, and I'm glad we were able to help him figure out or paint as clear a picture as we could
right,
what the issue was, and get to the bottom of it.
for sure. That was that was a great one. Will, again, thank you. Big tip of the hat for the intellectual stimulation and all the puzzle figuring out, because that really does like trip my trigger and makes me just kind of like it revs me up for the next one.
This is figuring out these puzzles. I mean, it is interesting, and that's one of the inspirations for this series is like, okay, well, if we find something like this, we run into this, what are the signs that we've seen? What can we can we put this information together? Can we tell this story so that then hopefully if somebody else runs into these same problems, maybe this helps. Maybe this gives you a point of a place to look and that sort of thing.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Now, kind of related to this, we want to talk about Donut Media and their recent HiLow WRX engine failure.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been working on Will's problem, and then this video cropped up, and Donut Media basically had an engine failure in their HiLow WRX, and they put out a video going through the whole thing, and they're definitely car people. It's a huge channel, and they do a lot of cool stuff. But I'd say that they're kind of Subaru people, but they're not like Subaru people exclusively. And so they had this issue, and we wanted to take a look and maybe just kind of go through what they talk about in the video, what we know, and just kind of make a critical perspective on what may have gone on, what may have precipitated the failure, and if there were any takeaways. Because the way that it was kind of the picture that was painted of Subarus is something that is common on the internet, which is that Subaru engines are prone to failure. They have weaknesses, like they have oiling issues. And that's kind of what was discussed.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's one of these things. It's hard to say that it's not the case when they basically had an engine that had a failure in 200 miles. But we wanted to take a look at it and talk about what we know from what they've discussed and give a perspective on it.
Absolutely, and with brand new engine, dropped in, right?
Well, and so what they say is that, so with this HiLow project, they went through and rebuilt the engine in their, I think it was 2006 or 2007 WRX.
Yeah.
So that they would know that they were starting from a new engine that should be solid, so that they would, have a solid basis for creating this series, which makes a lot of sense. Totally get it.
I get it, So within having a failure in less than 200 miles.
Yeah.
Wow. Like, I mean, if you're at the track and you're having a great day, and then your engine sounds like, you're stomping your feet through the gravel or something, that's going to put a hamper on your fun real quick.
Right. In fact, they had it towed away from the track as they were starting to do the shooting with it.
Sad day.
Now, so one of the key details is that, so they basically said in the video that they did not break the engine in. They put the engine in, and sounds like they immediately started beating on the car and took it to the track to start shooting their series.
Yeah, so I mean, that's bold, but also understandable. Like you got this project, and like we said, known good parts. If you have known good parts, you should, in theory, be able to go out and have some fun.
Yeah. So on teardown, so it was a number 3 rod bearing failure. But all the rod bearings had scoring and signs of wear. The main bearings had signs of pitting, which is interesting to me. And you can go watch the video and you can kind of see their whole breakdown. But so what they were saying is that it looks like oil starvation is what caused the failure, which certainly appears like it should have. Yeah, but again, like they mentioned, well, the internet says these engines are weak and that they're prone to oiling issues, and it looks like that caught them. Now, and then another one of the motivations to come and just kind of talk through this is because, they have 2 WRXs. They have a high and a low. They have 2 of them. And at the very end of this video, they're like, hey, is this going to be the first engine failure in one of our cars? They've already said no.
Yeah.
So there's probably either they're very down on the Subaru platform at this point, or they have had another failure that they haven't really detailed yet.
Man, I hope not. I mean, I love my Subaru. I've got an 04 Forester that I've gone to the track with, and I've done a lot of things. Not all of them are Forester friendly things, but they were a lot of fun. It's got about 400 horsepower, and it's a great toy.
Yeah.
And knock on wood, I haven't had any of these oiling issues.
Right. And that's where, like, we wanted to touch and bring this up and talk about it because this is the kind of thing that, it's gotten a lot of attention. And somebody that has a Subaru and aspires to go to the track, take it to the track, have fun with their car, this is something that can really kind of, deter people. This is something that can make people decide, well, it's not worth it. I don't want to go there because if Subarus really have all these issues and whatnot, what's going to happen to my car? So we want to kind of talk through it and bring our experience to the table and, at a minimum talk about, well, what could you do if you're in a similar situation, if you have a newly built engine and you want to take it to the track, etc. What are some steps that you could take, some things you could do to try and ensure that, with the best chance possible that you're not going to have the same outcome?
Absolutely. I mean, if I've got a fresh rebuild engine, I know I'm going to be itching to go out and have the fun because right now I'm in the planning stages of a rebuild for Platypus just because she's got a little time on her.
Yep.
But I'm going to make sure I'm doing a proper break-in process. I'm going to go 500 miles and I'm going to change. I'm going to go 500 miles again and I'm going to change. So
let's talk about a break-in process, and they admit, the guys at Donut Media admit that maybe not doing the break-in is what facilitated part of this issue. But why is break-in important? Why do you think break-in is important?
Well, you need to make sure that because all these are modular components that are not yet part of one singular unit. So you need them all to kind of, for lack of a term, meet and greet. You need to have pieces meld together to make one cohesive unit. So you need
the rings and the cylinders. They have to mesh together, get to the point where they're sealing properly, mated together properly, and that just comes from use.
Just a wear-in period, And so what you normally would do is you run a high zinc oil additive or a break-in oil because there's a million of them out there, and they all work really well to help facilitate this cohesion of crankshaft and bearings and ring lands and everybody just kind of, hey, let's make an engine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't happen overnight. This is a wear-in process.
Well, there's actually hard break-in and soft break-in. There's two different approaches to it. Some people say that it does happen fairly quickly.
Yeah.
There's and we're not even going to go down. That's like, tastes great, less filling. There's merit to both schools of thought.
Yes.
But the point is that meshing does have to happen. And one of the reasons that they say to change your oil a lot in a break-in process is because as these pieces are wearing together and meshing together, there's going to be small, very, very small parts of metal and stuff that come off.
Right.
So you want to change the oil frequently to get the oil out of the sump. Get these particles out of the sump, get the particles out of the oil filter, get a fresh oil filter in there, and refresh the oil a few times to facilitate the break-in process, but also to make sure that you don't have any kind of metal contamination that is contained in the pan just as a factor of this break-in process.
Yeah.
The other part of it, like for that initial oil change, is usually assembly lube is used when you're putting together an engine or assembling heads and whatnot.
Yes.
And that's to basically lubricate everything before full oil pressure is getting in there. But once the oil gets hot, it's going to melt all that assembly lube, or the assembly lube is going to get in with the oil. You want to get that assembly lube out and get the regular oil in.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of reasons to do a couple of oil changes after a new engine is built and installed in the car to just kind of, facilitate the break-in, get anything that's coming out from the break-in process out of the sump, and keep the fresh oil going.
Most definitely. And, so if we wanted to touch on, this could have been a hard break-in is what they were going for.
Sure.
And that's, like you said, that's perfectly, there's merit to that.
And I'll say we've done it on the Pikes Peak car.
Yeah.
A couple times out of necessity, we've had to do it, and we've never had this. We've never had this issue. It could certainly be in this case that the cars are not registered, so you don't have the ability to put in 100, 500 break-in miles on the street, and that with the race car break-in miles is tricky.
Right.
I'll throw out there, if you have a dyno shop that you work with, you can potentially use a dyno to break in an engine as well.
Yeah.
Other than just acceleration, wide up the throttle, whatever. engine braking is an important part of engine braking too. And so like actually dyno can help facilitate that because you can lift off the throttle and let the momentum of the drums kind of help facilitate the engine braking too. So there's a that might be an option if you've got a dyno shop that you work with. You can get some time on the dyno to break in the engine if it's for some reason it's a race car.
Right.
Say that you can't drive on public roads to get those miles.
Interesting. I want to touch, circling back on when they did the teardown. We mentioned the pitting on the bearings and oil starvation. Well, one interesting thing that does happen on track is, maybe not everyone's thinking about is, all fluids are dynamic. Mm-hmm. So when you're moving, when you're having fun, cruising those corners, your oil's kind of sloshing back and forth and sloshing back and forth.
Sure.
So maybe there could be times when the pickup doesn't get enough oil.
Right. So, and that's certainly a possibility. But what I would actually say to that in this circumstance is knowing that they were early on with very little break-in process to the engine. Mm-hmm. When you don't have the rings and seated into the cylinder walls 100% yet, you're going to have more blow-by.
Right.
You're going to have more combustion gas that gets into the crankcase. That's one of the things that I wondered initially with this is what they didn't talk about the oil level in the pan when they tore the engine down. I want to know, was any oil used? Was the oil low? Was there signs of oil in the intercooler or the turbo inlet hose? Because that would indicate that oil is moving through the PCV system. One of the risks in going and taking a fresh build and going right to the track or right to hard use is if you don't have that meshing yet, that you're going to have more leak down, more blow by into the crankcase. And we've known, and we've talked a lot about it on this channel, where if you have pressure that's getting in the crankcase that's not properly dealt with, then that can cause issues. It can move oil through the PCV system and out of the sump. And I don't know that that's the case here, but that's one of the top questions that I have is, were they moving oil through the PCV system because it was such a fresh build?
Yeah.
And maybe everything wasn't seated properly because, oil can certainly slosh around. But with Subarus, if you start using oil and the oil level gets low, that's where you're going to get it's going to be a lot more likely that you might have issues with that oil movement if the oil level is low versus if the sump is full.
Okay, so maybe I've never been to the track and I go out with my car and I go out and I have a really great hot section. I have all the fun in the world. I'm like, man, I really want to do this some more. What should I do when I get back into the pits, when we're done with our quick session?
Well, and that's, you want to basically let the car cool down properly. Let the engine idle for a few minutes. If you can do a cool down lap on track, that's certainly one ideal thing to do. And a lot of times that's why, when you're at the track, they give you the checkered flag as you're crossing start finish. From that last lap, that doesn't mean, go as hard as you can into the pits. That's okay, take it easy now that you've gone through the checkered flag, finish, take this one last lap. Just take it easy, let the brakes cool down, let the engine cool down, let the air move over the engine with, not a lot of load on it so that everything is kind of cooling down as you're coming into the pits. And then you come into the pits and you let the car idle for a few minutes to let, keep the fluids moving, let everything cool off before you shut the engine down.
Okay.
Then you let the car sit for a little bit and then you give it a once over. You walk around the car, you check your brakes, you check for any, check your brakes, check your tires, check for anything that looks off. And then at some point there, after the car is set for a bit, you want to just check your dipstick, check the oil. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, and I could totally see it being on the track, doing a shoot for a day, you've got a lot to get done, and it's a fresh build, and you think everything's fine. How much monitoring of the engine was being done during the day? Because if you have an issue and it's not being monitored, then obviously it could be something that's progressing quickly through the day, and then it gets to the point. We could certainly get to the point where it's catastrophic.
Yeah.
That's the other part, back to the break-in, that I want to say is the other part of break-in that I think is missed, which is you want to make sure that you don't have any critical problems. And I think one of the reasons that a lot of engine builders and stuff have a very long break-in procedure, it's very detailed and have you stay out of boost and stuff for a long time, is in part because they want to give you time with the engine, time with the car, monitoring a lot of things, changing all these fluids, so that if there is something that's off, there's a hose clamp that's loose, there's a hose that's not seated properly, you're having an issue getting the rings to seat into the cylinders and maybe you have excessive blow-by or something like that for that initial maybe 50, 100, 200 miles, that you're paying attention to everything, you're changing the fluids and everything, so that that issue doesn't progress to something where you have a catastrophic failure.
Right.
It's also a monitoring period for the new engine. It's a get to know you period for the engine. Find out, okay, is this engine using any oil? How is it working? Is it moving any oil through the PCV system to the air oil separator, whatever? It's giving you a lot of time to really get comfortable with the engine, know what the engine is doing, so that, if you have any kind of issues with the install, etc., you can deal with it, and it's not going to be a catastrophic failure.
Yeah. So looking back at Will's situation, if you've got a fresh build and maybe you asked the engine builder for it to be a little more loose,
right,
you definitely would be monitoring your oil pressures pretty diligently at that point when you're, especially with this fresh build, right?
Sure.
So,
well, and to that same extent, like let's kind of merge the two. That's why we put these two together. Is one kind of maybe informs the other.
Yeah.
So you get a freshly built engine, and you're having this P0021 code, AVCS, which is kind of known to result oftentimes from low oil pressure. Okay, that's a cause and motivation to do what Will did and start getting data, getting information, really looking the engine over.
Mm-hmm.
And when you take the car to the track right away from a fresh engine build or putting a new engine in the car, a lot of times you just don't have time to realize that this problem is occurring, and it's not as easy to do that due diligence of research and troubleshooting to figure out if there's a problem, what that problem is.
Right. But yeah, I think it's interesting. Like when we brought these two together, I was like, man, this really feels like a good melding of the two worlds.
This is a good conversation to have, and we wanted to have that conversation so that if you're out there and you've watched the Donut Media video and you've kind of got a soured opinion about Subaru oiling systems, there's more to it than that. It's not just this simple thing, because like I said, you've taken your car to the track.
Yeah.
You haven't had a bearing failure. I've taken my car to the track a bunch of times, always with the stock pan and pickup, never had a bearing failure.
Right.
Back to the Pikes Peak car. There have been a couple instances where we had to put new engines in the car, and we did not have time to break it in because we've I think twice now we've had circumstances where in testing leading up to race week we had an engine failure. Basically, I had to put the new engine in the car. The break-in was the first testing on the mountain.
Oh man!
And basically that first engine got run through racing, and we've never had a failure in that process. But what I can definitely tell you is a known circumstance is if you have an oiling issue where you're moving oil through the PCV, you're using the oil, engine is consuming a lot of oil and so forth, and you run the engine low on oil, then that can certainly precipitate a bearing failure. No question about it. Yeah. So it's just, there's more to it than that. It's just, when a circumstance like this comes up, I just, more than anything, just didn't want it to seem like this was the norm. Because it was kind of talked about in certain circumstances like it was the norm, or it was very common.
Yeah. And
it hasn't happened, yes, but there's a ton of people that take their Subarus to the track that don't have this issue. I think there's more going on here. There's more of an underlying issue. There must have been something else that contributed to this. It's not just an inherent flaw with Subarus on the whole.
Right, because I've been to a myriad of track days because I am of an age where I've been to a few in my youth and exuberance where I was like, I'm going to go to the track every weekend.
Yeah.
And I don't think we ever saw anybody in all the cars. It had to have been hundreds of cars and hundreds of laps where there's not been, knock on wood again, a bearing failure at the track.
It has happened. It's obviously happened. Right. If you follow Subaru racers, Dussek's just had another bearing failure. But he got to the point where he is now pulling 2 Gs in a corner, and he's still on, basically a wet sump oiling system with a stock oil pump. That's a lot of side load. That's nothing that most of us are going to do with, street tires and without aero. It's without doing a lot of work to the car.
So those are kind of like, that's another extreme situation there where we've got like purpose-built like race car.
Well, and he's been data logging, and he knows he's actually been playing with tires, fresh tires, playing with alignment setups, getting to the point where he's getting crazy amounts of grip in the corners.
Mm-hmm.
He's been measuring the increase, and then he got to the point where he had a bearing failure, unfortunately. But this is again part of the data, part of the troubleshooting.
Yeah,
is he has this data to look at and go like, well, here's now what is precipitated. And like with the Pikes Peak car, that's why we went to the dry sump system.
Right.
And that's a whole nother topic. But it's if you're going to be serious about building a race car, making a lot of grip, a lot of aero, and going fast. I mean, there are things that can be done to the oiling system,
Right.
to improve it. And I think that to give the guys that done Media a lot of credit, they kind of come in. They want to come in from a baseline of a stock car and then build it up and show you what that build process is. And it's really unfortunate that they got bit at the beginning of that process. And it sounds like, I think they're going to keep going with it. I hope they keep going with it.
I do too. I think it's really fascinating because I loved watching as they tore the engine down, went through things with a borescope. I really, really want a Bluetooth borescope now.
That was super cool.
Like, that was really cool piece of hardware.
Yeah.
But getting in and really looking at all the fine details. Checking spark plugs, checking bearings, doing all the things, like a really thorough teardown, which was like really cool to see. Like, for anyone who's never imagined what the inside of your engine looks like, this is a great one to check out and see what happens and why.
Yeah, but it's again, like, I think that there's certainly a possibility. Maybe this is their plan, is to talk about, well, what can be done. Can you put on different oil pans or pickups or whatever to help kind of the oiling system, different oil pump, what have you? And there are certainly options out there. There's a lot of options out there that are improvements to the oiling system.
Right.
But I just didn't want it to come across to people to make them think that you had to do all of those things before you went to the track on the first day.
Definitely.
Because like I really feel like if you're going to the track and you're paying attention to the car, and you're just on street tires, and you're going to check your oil levels. Hopefully you change the oil before you go to the track, so you've got full oil, fresh filter for go to the track, and just pay attention to the car. That the chances of this happening are quite low.
Right.
There's always a chance, certainly, but it's quite low. It's definitely not a given.
No.
That's the thing. And the other thing too, the other advantage you have if it's your car and you've lived with it and you've driven it a lot, is where you're at. If the car's using oil or not. Yeah. Now, certainly going to the track, things might change, but if you go in and that driving your car on the street, you're using, almost no oil, or say that you're using a half quart to a quart of oil every 1,000 miles. Okay, well, the degree to which you're going to need to pay attention to what's going on with the engine and the oil in there, you know where the attention needs to be every time you come off track. Absolutely. Versus like putting on a fresh engine, not really having that knowledge, that relationship with the car, and just kind of going in there more blind.
Right. But yeah, I really want to make sure, like, when I go to the track, I bring oil. Yeah. Just in case. Obviously, being a forester, I bring, like, the grill, the cooler, the chairs, the oil, the fuel, all the things, a place for the dog to sleep, all the places, like, all the things. But number one is definitely the vital lifebloods of your car, just in case, like, maybe something happens when you're on, you're driving, and then you get that P0021 pops up while you're on track. Immediately, like, hit the hazards,
take it easy, come off track,
get off track,
check everything out,
go and give it a quick exam, and find that, oh, well, shoot, I was a quart and a half down, but I was really giving it the beans when I was out there, so I should have maybe understood that there's going to be a little bit more. Go back out, top it up, reassess, go out and have some fun.
Well, and maybe is a good place to end this. If you want to go to the track, but this is raised concerns for you to do so, reach out to your local Subaru community. People that are in your area that are going to the track that you go to. Like here in Colorado, we're fortunate enough to have a pretty big and pretty active Subaru community that's going to the various tracks that we have out here. Reach out to the Subaru community and find out what they do, what they recommend. Get their take on it, their experience with it, because obviously there's people that are taking their Subarus to the track, and tap into that knowledge base and that experience base, so that if you've got questions, you need information, you're certainly welcome to reach out to us at Flanders Tuning as well, but get a better sense of, like, okay, what are normal things I need to do before I go to the track? What do I need to pay attention to at the track? What are some concerns I need to be aware of, or what should I do?
A little bit of track day prep. It sounds kind of like an episode for a podcast, doesn't it?
Sure, maybe it's something we'll talk about here in the future for sure. But I don't want this to dissuade you. Talk to people in your area, talk to guys that are actually out there doing it, and just get get the information that you need to hopefully go out there to the track, enjoy your car with confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And like John said, reach out to us. And also, I want to plug the Discord. You want to reach out to a bunch of extreme enthusiasts of all levels of skill and all knowledge bases. Hit up our Discord, because you can find a lot of great information there and a lot of people that can say, oh yeah, I've never had an issue, or I had this issue, but it was because this, and this is what I did to prevent it.
Yep, absolutely. It's a good resource, good way to tap into the flat irons tuning knowledge base, our customer base, and reach out to us through live chat, what have you.
Yeah.
Get the questions answered that you need so you can do what you want to do.
Absolutely. And please go out to the track. It is so much fun, and it's just like a great release of stress, because we all have a little bit of that in our lives.
A little bit.
So going out there to just have a good time. You don't have to be, it's not a race. You don't have to be the fastest. You don't have to get across the line first. Just go out and have a great time.
Just being there. It can just be fun, even if you're not going for times or going fast at all. I mean, it's a fun experience. It's a fun way to use your car. I would say how Subaru intended you to use it.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely. Well, at the end here, as we're wrapping it up, just want to say again, for Hey, What's Your Problem? We need your problems. We need your questions so that we can come back, compile all those, put them together for another episode. So if you've got anything that you want to throw at us as far as get our input on or whatnot, leave it in the comments below. Reach out to us through Instagram or Facebook. You're welcome to reach out to us through the contact us email on the website, Flat Irons Tuning website, or through live chat there. And we will do our best to keep cultivating all these questions, put them together, and come back for the next episode.
Absolutely. And one more time, just want to make sure to thank all our patrons. And if you want to become a patron to see this content early or kind of get some more input on what kind of content we put out there, hit up our Patreon. You can be a patron of Flat Irons Tuning, and your voice will be heard. We will listen to what you have to say and help you out.
Yeah, we'll always do our best.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much for your support. Thanks for watching as always. And until next time, stay tuned with Flat Irons Tuning.